Marcus Johnson parked his old blue car in the same spot he had used for the past 15 years. It was 6 o'clock p.m., and the sun was going down. Most teachers and students at Westfield Art Academy were leaving as Marcus arrived for his night shift. He grabbed his worn lunchbox and walked toward the service entrance at the back of the building. "Evening, Marcus," said the security guard, barely looking up from his phone. "Evening, Bill," Marcus replied with a small smile. The hallways of the prestigious art school were almost empty now. A few students hurried past him, their arms full of art supplies, not noticing the 58-year-old man in gray work clothes. Marcus was used to being invisible. He had worked as the night janitor here for so long that people hardly saw him anymore. In the small break room, Marcus put away his lunch and checked the cleaning schedule for the night. First up, the painting studios on the third floor. He pushed his cart of supplies into the elevator and headed up. The studios were messy, as usual. Paint splatters on tables, clay on the floor, paper scraps everywhere. But Marcus didn't mind. He loved being surrounded by art, even if he was just cleaning around it. As he moved through the room, he studied the paintings left on the easels. "The shading is wrong," he whispered to himself, looking at a student's landscape. "The light should come from one direction." He moved on, sweeping and organizing, but his eyes kept returning to the paintings. What no one at Westfield knew was that Marcus had a secret. Every morning after his shift, he went home to his small apartment and painted. For hours, he would stand in front of his canvas in the tiny second bedroom he had turned into a studio. The walls were lined with his finished works, bright, powerful paintings that showed scenes from his childhood in Mississippi, abstract pieces full of emotion, and portraits of people from his neighborhood. Marcus had been drawing since he was a child, using whatever he could find: sticks in dirt, charcoal from the fire, pencil stubs his teacher threw away. But no one had ever taken his art seriously. His father called it a waste of time, telling him to focus on real work that would put food on the table. Later that night, Marcus was mopping the floor outside the faculty lounge when he overheard two professors talking. "Did you see that janitor looking at the paintings in Studio 3? Said a woman's voice. He was actually critiquing them under his breath. Can you imagine? "Maybe he thinks cleaning up after real artists makes him an expert," replied a man, laughing. "Next, they'll be giving lectures on technique." Their laughter stung, but Marcus kept mopping, his face calm. He was used to this too. At 2 o'clock a.m., Marcus took his break in the empty gallery where the school displayed professional artwork. Tonight featured paintings by a famous modern artist whose work sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Marcus stood in front of a large abstract canvas, studying the brushstrokes and color choices. "I could do better," he thought, not with pride but with simple certainty. He knew he could, because he already had, in the paintings that filled his apartment that no one had ever seen. When his shift ended at 5 o'clock a.m., Marcus drove home as the sky began to lighten. While others were still sleeping, he mixed his paints, picked up his brush, and started to create. Today's canvas would be special. Something was telling him it was time for the world to see what he could do. Marcus woke up at noon after sleeping just 5 hours. His small apartment was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. The walls of his living room were covered with his paintings, colorful scenes of cotton fields from his childhood, faces of people he had known, and abstract designs that seemed to move with energy. He made himself a simple lunch of eggs and toast, then walked to his makeshift studio. The morning light streamed through the window, landing on his newest painting. It showed the janitor mopping floors in an art gallery, but the janitor's shadow on the wall was shaped like a famous artist painting at an easel. Marcus nodded at it, satisfied with his work. "One day," he whispered to himself, "one day they'll see." Later that afternoon, Marcus's neighbor Elaine knocked on his door. She was a kind woman in her 60s who sometimes brought him cookies. "Marcus, I was wondering if you could help me hang a picture," she asked. "Of course," Marcus said, letting her in. Elaine stopped in the middle of his living room, her eyes wide as she saw his paintings for the first time. "Marcus, did you paint all these?" she asked, walking slowly around the room. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, suddenly feeling shy. "These are wonderful. I had no idea you were an artist," she said, studying a painting of children playing in a river. "How long have you been painting?" "All my life, really. More seriously for about 20 years now." "Have you ever shown these to anyone? In a gallery, I mean?" Marcus shook his head. No, who would want to see a janitor's paintings? Elaine frowned at him. Art is art, Marcus. It doesn't matter who made it. Marcus smiled but didn't argue. He had heard differently too many times. That night at work, Marcus cleaned the faculty lounge where a small meeting was happening. Professor Williams, the head of the painting department, was talking with other teachers about an upcoming art show. We need more diversity in the community exhibition this year, Professor Williams said. Last year was too predictable. Marcus kept his head down as he emptied the trash cans, trying to be invisible as usual. But when he accidentally knocked over a small trash bin, everyone looked at him. Sorry, he mumbled, picking up the scattered papers. It's just the janitor, said Professor Clark with a dismissive wave, as I was saying about the exhibition. Marcus felt his face grow hot, but he silently continued his work. As he left the room, he heard Professor Clark say, Did you know he thinks he's an artist? I saw him sketching in his notebook during his break once. Probably stick figures. The room filled with laughter. Marcus closed the door behind him, his hands shaking slightly on his cleaning cart. Back in the empty hallway, Marcus took a deep breath. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his small sketchbook. He always carried it with him to draw ideas that came to him during work. He opened it to a detailed sketch he had made of Professor Clark sleeping with his mouth open during a faculty meeting last month. The likeness was perfect. Marcus smiled to himself and put the sketchbook away. Then he continued down the hall, pushing his cart. The next morning, Marcus saw a poster on the bulletin board about the community art exhibition, open to all local artists, it said in bold letters. The exhibition would be held right here at Westfield in just 3 weeks. Marcus stared at the poster for a long time. Something inside him whispered that this might be his chance, but another voice, louder and more familiar, told him to stay invisible, to keep his art to himself. As he walked to his car, his mind was spinning with possibilities. For the first time in years, he wondered what would happen if people actually saw his work. Would they laugh like the professors, or would they see what Elaine had seen? Marcus drove home slowly, not yet knowing that his life was about to change forever. For 3 days after seeing the exhibition poster, Marcus couldn't sleep properly. During his night shifts, he cleaned the academy floors with extra care while thinking about his paintings sitting unseen in his apartment. Each morning when he returned home, he stood in front of his latest work, a large canvas showing the man standing at a crossroads with 2 different shadows stretching behind him. What should I do? He asked the empty room. On the 4th day, Marcus was surprised by another knock on his door. It was Elaine again, holding a plate of cookies. I brought these for you, she said, stepping inside. And I wanted to ask if you thought about that art exhibition at your school. Marcus took the cookies and sighed. I've thought about it, yes, but I don't think I should enter. Why not? Elaine asked, crossing her arms. The people there, they wouldn't understand my work. They already think I'm just a janitor who can't possibly know anything about art. Elaine walked over to one of his paintings, a powerful image of his grandmother's hands picking cotton, the sun setting behind her. This is real art, Marcus, she said firmly. Better than half the paintings I've seen in galleries downtown. Marcus smiled slightly but shook his head. Thank you, but... No buts, Elaine interrupted. I have a suggestion. Enter your work, but don't put your full name on it. Just use your initials, MJ. That way, your paintings will be judged fairly, without anyone knowing they were created by the night janitor. Marcus considered this idea. It seemed like a safe way to test the waters. I'll think about it, he promised. The next day was the deadline for exhibition entries. Marcus still hadn't made up his mind when he arrived at work. The application forms were stacked on a table in the main office. As he cleaned the room after hours, he picked one up and read it carefully. At 4:30 a.m., just before ending his shift, Marcus returned to the office. The building was completely silent. With a trembling hand, he filled out the form, writing only MJ in the artist's name field. He selected 3 paintings to enter: Grandmother's Hands, Midnight Blues, and The Invisible Man. He carefully described each one on the form. Before he could change his mind, he slid the completed form into the submission box. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of anxiety for Marcus. He delivered his carefully wrapped paintings to the exhibition coordinator, a young woman who had no idea she was speaking to the same man who cleaned her office every night. "These are from MJ," he said simply, handing over his precious works. "Thanks," she replied, barely looking at him. "We'll take good care of them." The night before the exhibition opening, Marcus carefully cleaned the gallery where all the selected artworks were now displayed. When no one was watching, he slipped in to see where his paintings had been placed. To his shock, all three of his works had been given prominent positions on the main wall. A small sign next to them read, "Featured Artist, MJ." Marcus felt dizzy. He leaned against his mop for support. Someone had selected his work as a featured artist of the exhibition. His paintings, the ones professors had assumed would be stick figures, were now the centerpiece of their community show. As he finished his cleaning duties that night, Marcus overheard Professor Williams talking to the gallery director. "Who is this MJ?" Professor Williams asked. "The work is extraordinary. Such emotional depth and technical skill. I'd love to meet the artist." "We don't know much about them," the director replied. "The application was very minimal, but they're definitely coming to the opening tomorrow night." Marcus smiled to himself as he pushed his cleaning cart out of the room. Yes, he would be at the opening tomorrow night, but not as anyone expected. He would be there in his gray work uniform, quietly watching from the shadows as people finally saw his art. For the first time in years, Marcus Johnson felt truly visible. The evening of the exhibition opening arrived. Marcus finished his regular cleaning duties early, then changed into fresh work clothes in the staff bathroom. He combed his gray streaked hair neatly and splashed water on his face. His heart was beating fast as he pushed his cleaning cart into the gallery area. The large room was already filling with people in fancy clothes. Teachers, students, and local art lovers held wine glasses and talked excitedly. Marcus quietly moved around the edges of the room, emptying small trash cans and looking busy. No one paid any attention to him. He was just the janitor, invisible as always. Marcus slowly worked his way toward the main wall where his three paintings hung. A crowd had gathered there. He positioned himself near a potted plant and pretended to clean a spot on the floor while listening to the conversations. "The technique in these paintings is remarkable," said Professor Williams, gesturing toward grandmother's hands. "Look at how the light catches on her skin. You can feel the years of hard work in those fingers." "And the composition is perfect," added another teacher. This unknown MJ clearly understands classical principles while bringing something fresh and authentic. Marcus bent down to pick up a napkin someone had dropped, hiding his smile. A tall man in an expensive suit stood studying the Invisible Man for a long time. Marcus recognized him from art magazines, Richard Bennett, a famous critic from New York. Bennett took notes in a small book as he examined the painting. "Extraordinary," Bennett muttered. "The symbolism is powerful without being obvious. Who is this artist?" The gallery director approached Bennett. "We're hoping the mysterious MJ will reveal themselves tonight. The work has created quite a buzz." As the evening continued, Marcus watched more and more people gather around his paintings. Students took photos. Professors discussed the technical aspects. A local news reporter interviewed people about their reactions. Professor Clark, who had laughed about the janitor's art just weeks earlier, stood in front of Midnight Blues with a glass of wine. "The emotion in this piece is palpable," he told a group of students. "This is what I've been trying to teach you all semester, art that speaks directly to the soul." Marcus almost laughed out loud. Instead, he picked up his mop and cleaned the floor near Professor Clark's expensive shoes. At 8:30 p.m., the gallery director tapped a glass for attention. The room grew quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming to our community exhibition. Tonight, we've seen wonderful work from many talented local artists. But I think we can all agree that the highlight has been the powerful paintings by our featured artist, MJ." The crowd applauded enthusiastically. "We had hoped that MJ would identify themselves tonight so we could properly honor their contribution. Is the artist here with us?" The room went silent as people looked around expectantly. Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment he had both dreamed of and feared. Just then, he saw Elaine entering the gallery. She spotted him immediately and walked straight over. "There you are," she said loudly. "Everyone is looking for you. Why are you standing here with a mop?" The people nearby turned to look. Professor Williams frowned in confusion. "Excuse me," he said to Elaine. "Are you saying you know who MG is?" "Of course I do," Elaine replied with a big smile. "He's standing right here." She pointed at Marcus. A murmur of confusion spread through the crowd. Professor Clark laughed. "The janitor? Very funny, ma'am." Marcus straightened his back and took a deep breath. Then he stepped forward, leaving his mop against the wall. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he said in a clear voice. "I'm MJ, those are my paintings." The room fell completely silent. Everyone stared at him in shock. Marcus had never felt so scared or so proud in his entire life. The silence in the gallery was heavy. Everyone stared at Marcus, the man they had walked past for years without really seeing. Professor Clark's mouth hung open in disbelief. "You," he finally said, "you painted these works?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir. I've been painting for most of my life." The gallery director stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson, your work is remarkable, but I must ask, why didn't you use your full name on the application?" Marcus looked around at the sea of surprised faces before answering. "Because I wanted my art to be judged fairly. Not as the janitor's paintings, but simply as art." Richard Bennett, the New York critic, pushed through the crowd. He studied Marcus's face with intense interest. "Fascinating," he said. "I've been in the art world for 30 years, and it's rare to be truly surprised. Tell me, Mr. Johnson, what is the meaning behind the invisible man?" All eyes were on Marcus. Students had their phones out, recording the moment. For a second, he thought about running back to his cleaning cart and disappearing. But instead, he took a deep breath and pointed to his painting. "It's about being seen, but not seen," he explained. "The man in the painting is standing in a crowded room, but his body is transparent. Only his shadow on the wall is solid. That's how it feels sometimes, like people look right through you, even when you're standing in front of them." The crowd was silent, taking in his words. Several people looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing themselves in his description. Professor Williams stepped closer to the paintings. "The technique here? Where did you learn to paint like this?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Right here, sir. 15 years of watching students paint, listening to your lectures from the hallway while I cleaned, studying the works in the gallery after hours. Plus a lot of library books and practice at home." A young student raised her hand. "Can you tell us about grandmother's hands? It's so powerful." Marcus walked over to the painting of the elderly hands working in a cotton field. "This is my grandmother, Sarah. She picked cotton in Mississippi for 50 years. Her hands were strong but gentle. She could feel a ripe cotton boll without looking. She taught me to draw when I was just 5 years old, using sticks in the dirt because we couldn't afford paper." As Marcus spoke, his voice grew stronger. Years of stories and knowledge poured out of him. He explained color theory, composition techniques, and the historical influences on his work. The audience listened in amazement as the man they had ignored revealed his deep understanding of art. Professor Clark stood to the side, his face red with embarrassment. He remembered his jokes about the janitor's stick figures and how everyone had laughed. After 20 minutes of questions, the gallery director announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we should give Mr. Johnson some space. Please enjoy the rest of the exhibition. Mr. Johnson, would you join me in my office? I believe several people would like to speak with you privately." As Marcus followed the director, people stepped aside to make way. Some patted his shoulder or shook his hand. Students looked at him with new respect in their eyes. In the office, the director introduced Marcus to several important people, gallery owners from downtown, a museum curator, and Bennett, the critic. "Mr. Johnson," said one gallery owner, "I would be honored to show your work in my space next month. A solo exhibition, if you're interested." "The museum is planning a show on self-taught artists," added the curator. "Your paintings would be perfect." Bennett handed Marcus his business card. "I'll be writing about you in next week's column. This is the kind of story the art world needs, real talent breaking through, regardless of background." Marcus looked at the cards in his hand, still not fully believing what was happening. Just hours ago, he had been mopping floors, invisible to these same people. Elaine appeared at the door, beaming with pride. "I told you, Marcus. Art is art, no matter who makes it." For the first time in years, Marcus Johnson felt tears in his eyes. 2 weeks after the exhibition, Marcus's life had changed completely. Richard Bennett's article in the New York Art Review was titled The Invisible Artist: How We All Missed a Genius. It featured a large photo of Marcus standing proudly next to his paintings. The story quickly spread to other newspapers and websites. Every morning, Marcus woke up to new emails and phone calls. Gallery owners wanted his work. Art collectors asked for meetings. Television shows requested interviews. It was overwhelming for a man who had lived quietly for so long. "I don't know what to do with all this attention," Marcus told Elaine over coffee in his apartment. "You deserve it," she said firmly. "And you don't have to do everything they ask. You can choose." Marcus nodded. He had already decided to accept the solo exhibition at the downtown gallery. The owner, Ms. Rivera, had been kind and respectful, treating him like a real artist from the first moment. On a Wednesday morning, Marcus walked into Westfield Academy wearing a nice shirt instead of his work uniform. He had an appointment with the school director. Students whispered and pointed as he passed. Some even asked for his autograph. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming," said Director Adams, shaking his hand warmly. "Please have a seat." Marcus sat in the fancy office he had cleaned hundreds of times before. "I want to apologize for how you were treated here," the director began. "It's clear that we failed to recognize the incredible talent working among us." "No need to apologize," Marcus replied. "I chose to keep my art private. Nevertheless, we should have created an environment where you felt comfortable sharing your gifts." The director cleared his throat. "That's why I'd like to offer you a position at Westfield." Marcus raised his eyebrows in surprise. "We would be honored if you would teach a special workshop series on painting techniques. Your knowledge and personal journey would be invaluable to our students." Marcus thought about the offer. Teaching had never been something he considered, but he remembered all the times he had wanted to help students struggling with their paintings as he cleaned around them. "I would be happy to teach workshops," he said, "but I will need to work around my gallery schedule." Of course, the director agreed quickly. "Whatever works for you." As Marcus left the office, he passed Professor Clark in the hallway. The professor looked uncomfortable but stopped to speak. "Mr. Johnson, I want to apologize for my behavior. The things I said were unprofessional and unkind." Marcus could have walked past or said something angry. Instead, he simply nodded. "We all have things to learn, Professor. Maybe even from janitors." The following month, Marcus's solo exhibition opened at Rivera Gallery. All 50 paintings sold within 3 days. Prices ranged from $5,000 to $25,000. More money than Marcus had earned in years of cleaning floors. Ms. Rivera helped him set up a proper bank account and introduced him to a financial advisor. "This is just the beginning," she told him. "Your work is special. People can feel the truth in it." Marcus used some of the money to rent a real studio, a bright space with large windows and proper lighting. He bought high-quality paints and canvases for the first time in his life. But he kept his small apartment, not wanting to change everything at once. On the first day of his workshop at Westfield, Marcus stood nervously at the front of the classroom. 20 students watched him with eager faces. Among them was a young woman who worked in the school cafeteria. "Welcome to Finding Your Authentic Voice," Marcus began. "My name is Marcus Johnson. 6 weeks ago, I was the night janitor here. Today, I'm your teacher. But really, I've been an artist all along." He smiled at the cafeteria worker. "Just like some of you might be artists who haven't been discovered yet." The students leaned forward, ready to learn from a man who had proven that great art can come from anywhere, even from the hands that once cleaned their floors. 3 years passed quickly for Marcus. His life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. He now had a beautiful studio downtown, regular exhibitions across the country, and students who traveled from other states to attend his workshops. On a sunny Tuesday morning, Marcus received an important phone call. "Mr. Johnson, this is Patricia Wan from Sotheby's Auction House in New York," said a professional voice. "I'm calling about your early painting, Grandmother's Hands." Marcus sat down, surprised. "Yes? What about it?" "The collector who purchased it from your first exhibition has decided to sell. We expect significant interest. Would you be available to attend the auction next month? Your presence would add tremendous value to the event." Marcus thought about his grandmother Sarah, who had died 20 years ago, never knowing her hands would one day be famous. "I'll be there," he promised. When Marcus arrived in New York, A fancy hotel room was waiting for him. The auction house had arranged everything: car service, dinner reservations, even tickets to a Broadway show. It was a far cry from his old life of night shifts and mop buckets. The morning of the auction, Marcus put on his best suit, still not completely comfortable in such formal clothes. A car took him to the famous Sotheby's building where important art had been sold for hundreds of years. "Mr. Johnson, welcome," said Patricia Wham, leading him through the elegant auction rooms. "We placed grandmother's hands as a highlight of today's contemporary art sale." Marcus followed her to a grand room where his painting hung on a spotlighted wall. It looked different here, more important somehow, surrounded by works from famous artists he had studied for years. The estimated selling price is between $200,000 and $300,000, Patricia explained. Marcus felt dizzy. The painting had initially sold for $15,000, which had seemed like a fortune to him then. As the auction room filled with wealthy collectors and art dealers, Marcus noticed some familiar faces. Professor Williams and Director Adams from Westfield had come to support him. Even Professor Clark was there, standing awkwardly at the back of the room. Most surprising was the appearance of Richard Bennett, the critic who had first written about Marcus. He walked directly to Marcus with a smile. "The art world loves nothing more than a good story," Bennett said, shaking Marcus's hand. "And your story gets better every year. Did you know the Museum of Modern Art is interested in your work now?" Before Marcus could respond, the auction began. Various paintings and sculptures sold for impressive amounts. Marcus watched in amazement as people casually bid hundreds of thousands of dollars with small hand gestures. Then the auctioneer announced, "Lot 23, Grandmother's Hands by Marcus Johnson." This important early work shows the exceptional talent of an artist who has become a significant voice in contemporary American art. "We'll start the bidding at $200,000. A man in the front row immediately raised his paddle. $250,000, he said calmly. A woman near the back countered, $300,000. Marcus watched in shock as the bidding continued, quickly passing the estimated maximum price. $500,000, called out a man on the phone with a client. $750,000, responded another bidder. The room grew tense as the price climbed higher. Marcus's hands were shaking. He thought about his grandmother picking cotton for pennies a day, never earning in her lifetime what people were now bidding for a painting of her hands. When the bidding reached $1 million, many people stopped. Only two bidders remained: a woman representing a museum and a man bidding by phone. $1.5 million, said the woman firmly. $2 million, came the response from the phone bidder. The room gasped. Marcus couldn't breathe. $2.5 million, the woman countered, her voice slightly less confident. After a tense pause, the phone bidder said, $3.2 million. The woman shook her head. She was done. $3.2 million going once, going twice, sold to the telephone bidder, announced the auctioneer, bringing down his hammer with a sharp crack. The room erupted in applause. People turned to stare at Marcus, who sat frozen in his chair. His grandmother's hands, painted with love in his tiny apartment, had just sold for more money than he had ever dreamed possible. Patricia leaned over and whispered, "The buyer is the National Gallery. Your painting will hang among the greatest American artworks ever created." Tears rolled down Marcus's cheeks as he nodded, unable to speak. The hands that had guided his first drawings would now be seen by millions of visitors for generations to come. 5 years after his first exhibition, Marcus Johnson sat in his spacious studio overlooking the city. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating several half-finished paintings. At 63, his hair was now completely gray, but his eyes still held the same quiet intensity they always had. On his desk sat a letter from the president, inviting him to the White House for a special ceremony honoring American artists. Next to it was a contract for his upcoming book about his journey from janitor to celebrated painter. Life had changed dramatically, but Marcus still painted every day with the same passion he had when no one was watching. A young assistant knocked on the open door. "Mr. Johnson, your car is here. The ceremony starts in an hour." Marcus nodded and put down his brush. Today was an important day, one he had been planning for 2 years. He carefully placed his newest painting in a protective case and headed downstairs. The car took him back to Westfield Art Academy, where everything had started. The building looked the same, but a new sign hung over the entrance. The Marcus Johnson Center for Artistic Discovery. The school board had renamed the East Wing in his honor last year. Inside, the main gallery was filled with people, teachers, students, art lovers, and reporters. At the front of the room stood Director Adams and several important-looking people in business suits. "There he is," someone called as Marcus entered. The crowd parted to let him through, many reaching out to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. Director Adams welcomed him warmly. "Marcus, thank you for making this possible. Today is a historic day for Westfield and for artists everywhere." Marcus smiled and looked around the room. On the walls hung 20 paintings, none of them his own. Instead, these were works created by security guards, cafeteria workers, maintenance staff, and other service employees from the school and surrounding community. 6 months earlier, Marcus had announced the creation of the Johnson Foundation for Overlooked Artists. Using a large portion of his auction earnings, he had established a $5 million fund to provide grants, materials, and exhibition opportunities for talented artists working in service jobs. Today was the opening of the Foundation's first exhibition. "Ladies and gentlemen," Director Adams began, "5 years ago we failed to see the extraordinary talent working right beside us. Today, we celebrate not only Marcus Johnson's success, but also the launch of his foundation to ensure no other artist goes unrecognized simply because of their job title." The crowd applauded as Marcus stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he said in his calm, deep voice. "When I worked here as a janitor, I cleaned this room hundreds of times. I used to imagine my paintings hanging on these walls, but I was too afraid to show them. I don't want anyone else to feel that fear." He gestured to the artwork around the room. "Every one of these artists has something important to say. Some of them clean your offices. Some serve your food. Some fix your cars. But all of them deserve to be seen and heard." Marcus pointed to a powerful painting of a woman staring out a window. This was created by Maria Lopez, who has worked in the cafeteria here for 12 years. "Maria, please come forward." A small woman in her 50s walked nervously to the front. Her hands were work-worn, much like his grandmother's had been. "Maria's painting has already been purchased by the Contemporary Art Museum for their permanent collection," Marcus announced. The woman's eyes filled with tears as the room erupted in applause. One by one, Marcus introduced each artist. Some had been creating art for decades without showing anyone. Others had only recently discovered their talents through foundation workshops. The final artist was James, the current night janitor at Westfield. James had written powerful poetry for years while working his night shifts. James will be publishing his first book of poems next month through our foundation's publishing program, Marcus said proudly. As the ceremony ended, Marcus watched James shake hands with a famous poet who had attended the event. 5 years ago, that could have been him, finally being seen after years in the shadows. A student reporter approached Marcus. "Sir, how does it feel to return here as a celebrated artist when you were once ignored?" Marcus thought for a moment before answering. "It feels like coming full circle, but the circle is now much bigger, with room for many more artists inside it." That night, Marcus stayed behind after everyone left. He walked through the quiet gallery alone, looking at each painting carefully. Then he picked up a broom that someone had left against the wall and slowly swept a small area of the floor, remembering where he had come from and honoring the path that had brought him here.